Psychological Professional Practice Framework for Preventing and Addressing Sexual Abuse. This learning module examines sexual abuse and misconduct in the context of professional psychology in Alberta. The profession of psychology has well-established foundational ethical principles and standards of practice that are critical to the protection of the public. This module will outline the profession of psychology's requirements for preventing and addressing sexual abuse and misconduct. This module also defines key concepts such as professional boundaries, boundary crossings, and boundary violations. After reviewing this module, learners should be able to 1. Link the HPA's amendments to the profession of psychology's ethical and regulatory requirements. 2. Make explicit the Canadian Psychological Association's Canadian Code of Ethics for Psychologists requirements pertaining to professional boundaries, including sexual boundaries. 3. Summarize the regulatory authority of the College of Alberta Psychologists, CAP, along with the standards of practice and other regulatory requirements. 4. Define key concepts associated with professional boundaries. 5. Explain how informed consent is an important practice when establishing and maintaining professional boundaries. The first learning objective in this module focuses on contextualizing the HPA amendments in relationship to existing regulatory requirements found in the profession of psychology. There are a variety of legislative and regulatory documents to support psychologists in their professional practice. These documents include the Health Professions Act, the Psychologist Profession Regulation, the CPA Code of Ethics, the CAP Standards of Practice, the CAP Practice Guideline Preventing and Addressing Sexual Abuse and Misconduct, the CAP Patient Alert, Sexual Contact with Patients is Always Wrong, and lastly, the CAP Monitor Issue 58, published in the spring of 2019. It is the responsibility of all psychologists to stay informed of all regulatory documents and legislation and to align their professional practice behaviors to them for the protection and benefit of clients and the public. The Health Professions Act 3, 1D, requires the college to establish or adopt a code of ethics. The College of Alberta Psychologists has adopted the CPA Canadian Code of Ethics for Psychologists to guide members and encourage ethical decision-making when providing professional services. The Canadian Code of Ethics for Psychologists articulates the ethical principles and values that apply to the practice of psychology. Psychologists are encouraged to regularly consult the Canadian Code of Ethics in order to remain conversant and mindful of the ethical foundation of professional psychological practice. The CPA's Canadian Code of Ethics for Psychologists is organized around 4 ethical principles that are hierarchically arranged. Principle 1. Respect for the dignity of persons and peoples. This principle emphasizes inherent worth, non-discrimination, moral rights, distributive, social, and natural justice. In ethical decision-making, this principle is generally given highest weight when ethical principles are in conflict. Sexual abuse and misconduct does not respect the dignity or moral rights of individuals. Principle 2. Responsible caring. This principle states that responsible caring requires practitioner competence, efforts to maximize benefit and minimize harm, and to offset correct harm. It should be carried out only in ways that respect the dignity of persons and peoples. In decision-making processes, this principle is generally given the second highest priority when ethical principles are in conflict or in circumstances in which there is a clear and imminent danger of bodily harm to someone. Sexual abuse and misconduct demonstrates unskilled practice, causing harm to the client, significant others, and the profession. Principle 3. Integrity in relationships. Psychologists are expected to demonstrate the highest integrity in all of their relationships. This principle emphasizes accuracy and honesty, objectivity, lack of bias, straightforwardness, and lastly, avoidance of conflict of interest and exploitation. In ethical decision-making, this principle is generally given third highest weighting when ethical principles are in conflict. Sexual abuse and misconduct lead to dual roles and distorted judgments, where the psychologist is acting in their own personal interest and the well-being of the client is placed in jeopardy. This is a conflict of interest. Principle 4. Responsibility to society. A psychologist's responsibility to society should be carefully considered as part of the ethical decision-making process. This ethical principle emphasizes development of knowledge, beneficial activities, respect for society, and the responsibility for the well-being of individuals in society. In ethical decision-making, if the ethical principles are in conflict, this principle is generally given least amount of weight. Sexual abuse and misconduct are not beneficial activities to the individual and society. These behaviors do not align with professional and societal values. There is an inherent power imbalance in all professional relationships. This is especially true for psychologist-client relationships. Psychologists are often afforded a high degree of trust and deference with matters that are acutely sensitive, confidential, and personal, leading to client vulnerability. Consequently, the Canadian Code of Ethics for Psychologists explicitly cautions psychologists to avoid dual relationship and sexual boundary violations with the following: clients and their significant others, students, and supervisees. Psychologists do not practice, condone, facilitate, or collaborate with all forms of unjust discrimination or harassment, including those sexual in nature. The CPA Canadian Code of Ethics for Psychologists indicates that sexual contact with former clients may occur once the power imbalance has been determined to be no longer present. The College of Alberta Psychologists accepts that this power imbalance is enduring. For Alberta psychologists, interactions of a sexual nature with a current or former client is prohibited in perpetuity. From here, we will shift our attention to the College of Alberta Psychologists' regulatory role in preventing and addressing sexual abuse and misconduct. To protect the public, Alberta's Health Professions Act, HPA, Section 3, 1C, requires all regulated health professional colleges to establish, maintain, and enforce ethical principles and standards of practice for the regulated profession. The standards of practice translates foundational values into enforceable rules for the conduct of psychologists. The CAP standards of practice are the minimum standards of professional behavior and ethical conduct expected of all regulated members. Further, the rules outlined in the standards of practice are definitive, prescriptive, and have the force of law. The 2019 HPA amendments required each regulated health profession to adopt specific standards of practice related to sexual abuse and misconduct. The following standards of practice are particularly relevant to sexual boundary violations: informed consent for services, continuity of care, termination of services, dual, multiple relationships, relationships with supervisees, and harassment. In addition to the CAP standards of practice, there are 3 additional regulatory resources. These include the Practice Guideline, Preventing and Addressing Sexual Abuse and Misconduct, Issue 58 of the CAP Monitor, which is specifically dedicated to preventing and addressing sexual abuse and misconduct, and the Client Patient Alert, Sexual Contact with Patients, Clients, is always wrong. Preventing and Addressing Sexual Abuse and Misconduct is a practice guideline that outlines legislative definitions of key terms, changes to mandatory reporting requirements, legislated mandatory sanctions associated with findings of sexual abuse and/or misconduct, guidance on how to strengthen professional boundaries. Psychologists practicing in Alberta should be already familiar with the guideline and the legislated definitions. The Client Patient Alert, Sexual Contact with Patients, Clients, is always wrong, can be located on the CAP website. The alert includes legislated definitions, key message that sexual contact between a psychologist and client is never appropriate, and information and resources available to clients who make complaints through the college. Psychologists practicing in Alberta should be already familiar with the alert and the legislated definitions. Lastly, Issue 58 of the CAP Monitor focused on the 2019 HPA amendments. In addition to including copies of the Practice Alert and Practice Guideline, the Monitor also contained a summary of the updated standards of practice, a description of CAP's Patient Relations Program, and lastly, an additional article by the Complaints Director on knowing and setting limits. Societal and professional expectations increasingly demand sensitivity, respect, and accountability for all interactions, especially when a power imbalance exists. It is the responsibility of psychologists to align with societal expectations and abide by current regulatory requirements. This ensures the integrity of the profession and the safety of clients remains intact. Society has an expectation that all psychologists establish and maintain professional boundaries. The profession of psychology has a zero tolerance for sexual abuse and misconduct. Next, we turn attention to key concepts associated with professional boundaries. Professional boundaries are established from the ethical values reflecting commitment to doing no harm and to be of service to the well-being of the client. Professional boundaries increase emotional, interpersonal, and physical safety to counteract vulnerability and provide a trustworthy environment for clients to consider issues that may be difficult, sensitive, or private. In addition to noting the foundational ethical values, it is also helpful to revisit the notion of who is a client. Specifically, the term client is defined in the CAP Standards of Practice. While the term client typically refers to the recipient of professional services, it can be generalized to other individuals that may present a conflict of interest, including, but not limited to, students, trainees, supervisees, third-party payers and their representatives, research participants, etc. Professional boundaries also extend beyond current clients and includes, but is not limited to, former clients, but also those individuals that the psychologist knows to be close relatives to the client, such as guardians or significant others, such as a spouse, former spouse, child, sibling, parent, or grandparent. To gain further insight into boundaries, it is helpful to have a professional understanding of the following concepts: professional boundaries, boundary maintenance, boundary crossings, and boundary violations. Professional boundaries establish and define the parameters within which the professional services are delivered. They are an agreement that outlines the mutual responsibilities of all parties. For psychologists, these boundaries are established within the framework of ethical values and professional obligations. Maintaining boundaries reinforces the professional relationship and demonstrates that the psychologist is trustworthy and beneficent. Boundaries require ongoing reinforcement throughout a professional relationship. Because not all boundary considerations are clear or easy to identify, maintaining professional boundaries requires ongoing care and consideration. Recall that boundaries are dynamic and can evolve throughout the professional relationship. A professional boundary crossing is a departure from the usual norms of accepted psychological services. Boundary crossings may be interpersonal, financial, physical, spiritual, and/or cultural in nature. Generally, when the psychologist engages in a boundary crossing, they perceive the crossing as having benefits outweighing the perceived risks to the client. A boundary violation arises from an inadvertent and/or deliberate action or choice that is in violation of the nature of the professional relationship. Boundary violations have no benefit to the client and/or others. Although boundary crossings and violations may not be clear-cut, they are often multifactorial and complex. For example, psychologists may take actions that are perceived to be intrusive. As well, psychologists may also fail to take actions to reinforce professional boundaries. It is always the responsibility of psychologists to be aware of potential boundary issues and to negotiate, establish, and maintain professional boundaries. Boundaries are often dependent upon several factors and require prudent and mindful deliberation. Professional consultation is advised when addressing complex boundary issues with clients. Psychologists are to ensure the central focus of psychological services is always in the client's best interests at all times. The next learning objective focuses on the importance of the informed consent process as an essential professional practice. In psychology, essential professional practices include, but are not limited to, informed consent, record-keeping, and confidentiality. The informed consent process is paramount in establishing and maintaining boundaries and preventing sexual abuse and misconduct. Psychologists practicing in Alberta have access to multiple resources that explicitly cover informed consent. Psychologists are encouraged to reread the Code of Ethics, Standards of Practice, and practice guidelines on this topic, given how both societal and professional perspectives on informed consent have shifted over time. Please note that the college's Standards of Practice contain enforceable rules governing establishing and maintaining informed consent, and that these standards were updated and expanded in 2019. Informed consent facilitates the establishment and maintenance of professional boundaries and relationships. Informed consent is also dynamic in that it needs to be revisited throughout the professional relationship. Importantly, informed consent is not simply a document. It outlines the terms of professional engagement. In essence, it is a contract between the psychologist and the client. While formal informed consent documents are not always required, they can constitute best practice in specific high-risk areas and minimize risk to both clients and the psychologist. Informed consent in boundary establishment and maintenance occurs throughout the professional relationship. This includes talking about and documenting informed consent and boundary-related discussions at the initiation of services, when there is a change to initial service terms of engagement, when reasonably anticipated that a boundary crossing may occur, such as during certain times of the year and/or when clinical milestones are achieved, etc., at any significant break in the termination of the professional relationship. Traditionally, boundary crossings violations have often been seen along a continuum. This no longer holds true when the boundary violation is of a sexual nature. When a boundary violation is of a sexual nature, a clear dichotomy exists where it is always inappropriate under all circumstances. In summary, the profession of psychology is informed by government legislation, case law, a code of ethics, standards of practice, practice guidelines, and other documents. Together, these resources contribute to the regulatory framework for psychologists to establish and maintain professional relationships.